You know, it's really easy to overlook the incredible dedication of our federal employees. They're
Mhm.
sort of the hidden gears keeping the country running, right?
Yeah.
Delivering mail, caring for veterans, keeping airports safe.
Absolutely. A huge range of essential jobs.
But what happens when that service leads to an injury on the job? And maybe even more importantly, what happens then?
It's a critical question.
Yeah.
And the answer, well, it's often way more complicated than you'd think.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we want to explore the kinds of workplace injuries federal employees face, especially those represented by AFGE.
Right. And not just the injuries themselves, but the surprising complexities, the hurdles they hit when trying to navigate the federal workers' compensation system. That's the OWCP.
Our mission today is really to unpack those challenges and also highlight some resources designed to actually help them.
Yeah, and to do that, we've been looking at some really insightful material. It's from a document called AFGE Employee Injuries, OWCP Claim Challenges, and OWCP.doctor Utility. It gives a pretty comprehensive view, focusing particularly on federal workers in places like Kansas City and St. Louis.
Okay, let's dig into this. Because the scale, the sheer number of these injuries might surprise you. The Department of Labor's FECA program, it processes a huge number of claims.
It's actually kind of staggering when you look at it. In FY 2020 alone, over 90,700 claims
Wow.
and almost $3 billion paid out in benefits. It just shows how widespread this is. It's not just a few incidents here and there.
So when I think federal work, maybe my first thought is like an office job. But it sounds like the ways people get injured are much broader than that.
Oh, definitely. I mean, federal workers face many of the same risks as anyone else, sure, but certain jobs definitely carry specific elevated risks.
Like what?
Well, slips, trips, and falls. They're consistently right there at the top.
Okay.
You can picture it, right?
Yeah.
VA hospital staff moving quickly through busy clinics, or even an office worker catching their foot on something unexpected. Yeah. And those can lead to anything from bruises to really serious fractures or head injuries.
That makes sense. So besides those kinds of impacts, what other, maybe less obvious injuries pop up frequently?
Well, musculoskeletal strains,
Yeah.
overexertion injuries, they're incredibly common.
Okay.
A lot of federal jobs are physically demanding. Back strains, neck, shoulder issues. Think about VA medical staff
Yeah.
lifting patients or heavy equipment,
Right.
or postal workers, TSA officers handling heavy items, repetitive motions day in, day out.
Ah, the repetitive stuff.
Exactly. Repetitive stress injuries, they sneak up on you. For people doing desk work or those repetitive tasks, things like carpal tunnel, tendinitis, nerve problems,
Mm-hmm.
they can just develop slowly over time, an 8-hour shift every day.
And I suppose beyond those gradual strains, there's always the risk of more sudden acute incidents too.
For sure. Vehicle and equipment accidents are a real concern. Mail carriers, VA home health staff driving around, TSA instructors working with machinery.
Yeah.
The risks are definitely there, and those can be anything from cuts and crush injuries to much more severe outcomes like amputations in the worst cases.
Yeah. And what about things you can't necessarily see immediately, like illnesses from work?
That's another vital category. Occupational illnesses and exposure. It's less visible, maybe, but very serious.
Okay.
Healthcare workers in VA hospitals, for instance, risk contracting infectious diseases
Ah.
or exposure to hazardous materials. And there have even been concerns raised by, say, TSA officers about long-term exposure to X-ray radiation over years of service.
We've covered a lot of the physical side, but what about the mental toll? Does the
Eh,
system recognize things like work-related stress or trauma? That feels like a really complicated area.
And it is complicated. This is where it gets, well, truly tricky. Federal employees absolutely can suffer mental health injuries.
Okay.
High-stress jobs, prisons, veterans healthcare, disaster response,
Mm.
even workplace harassment. These can lead to anxiety, depression, PTSD.
Right.
But here's the really startling part. While physical injuries are generally accepted, getting a psychological injury claim approved is notoriously difficult.
Why is that?
The burden of proof is just immense.
Yeah.
You have to show it's unequivocally, directly work-related. It's like trying to prove something invisible. The criteria are incredibly strict.
Wow.
So even when the stress or trauma is undeniable, it creates this huge, often unseen barrier for employees. Which really brings us to the next point.
Yeah.
What makes navigating this whole claims process so challenging in the first place?
Yeah, you've painted a clear picture of the injuries, but it sounds like getting hurt is maybe just the first step, the actual process of getting compensation. That's where the real fight begins for many.
That's often the case, yeah.
Yeah.
If you look at the bigger picture, the OWCP process itself, It's just intricate, and employees hit several big hurdles right away.
Like what?
Well, a major one is simply a lack of information, or sometimes, believe it or not, a lack of support from their own management.
Really?
Yeah, imagine you're injured, you're maybe a bit shaken up, and your supervisor says something like, oh, just use your sick leave, it's easier. They might mean well, but that advice could actually steer you away from benefits you're legally entitled to. Many employees just aren't fully aware of their rights.
So they might get incorrect guidance.
Exactly. Or sometimes supervisors might even try to deny them the right to file or just delay sending the forms in. And the key thing to know is, by law, an injured federal worker always has the right to file a claim. The agency's job is just to process it, not decide if it's valid.
Okay, so just getting started can be tough. And then, assuming they do file, the paperwork itself sounds like a potential nightmare.
Oh, absolutely. That's another huge challenge. The sheer complexity of the procedures and the paperwork.
Yeah.
You've got different forms, like the CA1 for a sudden injury, the CA2 for something that developed over time, and they all have strict deadlines.
Deadline.
Yeah, for example, a traumatic injury claim. You really should file it within 30 days to make sure you get continuation of pay. Miss a deadline, fill out a form wrong, even a small error, it can easily get your claim denied. And that's incredibly daunting when you're already dealing with being hurt.
And I imagine even if the forms are perfect, you still need proof, medical proof linking the injury to the job.
Precisely. You need strong, compliant medical evidence. That's crucial. OWCP demands clear proof that the injury or illness is directly work-related.
Which means?
It usually means getting a detailed narrative report from your doctor, specifically explaining that causal link. But here's a common problem. Finding a doctor who actually understands OWCP's specific requirements and knows how to write that kind of report, that can be really, really difficult for injured workers.
Right, because not every doctor deals with federal workers' comp.
Exactly. Most don't.
And I guess the employing agency might not always be eager to see these claims go through either. Is there pushback sometimes?
Yes, that can happen too. Agency pushback isn't uncommon. They might controvert the claim, basically challenge it, or just slow walk the process. And sometimes there's pressure, subtle or not so subtle, for workers to just use their sick leave instead, or to come back to work before they're really ready, maybe out of fear for their job security if they stay out too long.
That sounds incredibly stressful.
It is. And finally, even if you do everything right, the adjudication process itself can take a long time, months, sometimes even a year or more for complex cases.
Months without pay.
Potentially, yes, if continuation of pay runs out or wasn't granted, and if the claim gets denied. The appeals process is just as complex and lengthy. It really highlights why getting it right the first time is so incredibly important.
So, putting it all together, for an injured worker trying to handle this alone, it sounds overwhelming. Is there any specialized help out there for them?
Absolutely, there is. And this is where services like OWCP.doctor really make a difference.
Okay.
Think of them as a bridge. It's essentially a network of medical clinics and providers who specialize only in federal workers' compensation.
So they know the system.
Exactly. They help employees find doctors who are already registered with the Department of Labor. And that's a game changer because OWCP will only pay the medical bills if the provider has that DOL authorization and genuinely understands the whole FECA process, which, like we said, most regular doctors just don't.
That sounds like it lifts a huge weight off someone's shoulders right away. What about the costs involved with that specialized care?
That's another critical benefit. For injuries that are accepted, federal workers' comp covers 100% of the medical costs.
100%.
Yep. These OWCP.doctor clinics, they bill everything directly to the Department of Labor. So the injured worker pays zero out of pocket.
Wow, okay.
It removes that huge financial worry, lets them just focus on getting better. And crucially, many of these providers also offer free help with the claims process itself.
Free help with the forms.
Yes. Their staff often includes claims experts who actually guide the employee through filling out the forms correctly, help gather the right medical evidence, basically maximizing the chances the claim gets approved.
That sounds invaluable.
It is. Their website even warns, and it's true, if you file your OWCP forms incorrectly, you could lose your benefits. We can help.
So it's not just the medical side, it's navigating that whole bureaucratic maze that can be just as tough as the injury itself.
Precisely. And they also understand the specific needs of different federal agencies.
How so?
Well, these clinics get the nuances of different federal jobs. They have experience with injuries common among postal workers or TSA officers, VA hospital staff, Department of Defense civilians.
So they tailor the care.
Exactly. targeted treatment, and the right kind of documentation for that specific agency. For instance, the clinic in Kansas City, they highlight special programs just for postal employees, including things like ergonomic advice to help prevent the injury from happening again.
That makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned Kansas City and St. Louis specifically. How does this specialized support actually play out on the ground in those cities?
Yeah, it's a good question. How does it work locally? In Kansas City, you've got major federal employers, the VA Medical Center there, that's AFGE, Local 910, big USPS facilities, TSA at the airport, IRS, USDA offices.
So a lot of federal workers.
A ton. And the common injuries reflect that national picture we talked about. Strains from patient handling or sorting heavy mail, slips and falls, repetitive stress from computer work or screening tasks.
Right.
So the OWCP.doctor affiliated clinic there is really set up to help those specific employees. Specialized care, plus those on-site claims experts to speed up recovery and make sure the claim gets filed properly.
And what's the story over in St. Louis? Similar situation.
Pretty similar challenges, yes. St. Louis is another big federal center.
Oh.
You've got the VA healthcare system, a large USPS distribution center, the National Personnel Records Center.
Okay.
So similar types of strain injuries, occasional accidents.
Yeah.
But there's also a really compelling example from just last year, May 2025.
Oh, yeah.
After a tornado hit St. Louis, the local OWCP-focused clinic actively reached out. They helped injured federal employees figure out their workers' comp benefits while they were dealing with the storm's aftermath. They even aligned their efforts with AFGE's relief work.
Wow, that really shows the human side of it, doesn't it? Stepping up in a crisis.
Exactly. It shows how these services can become a real lifeline, especially during tough times.
So, bringing this all together, what does this mean for you, the listener, and maybe our bigger understanding of what federal service involves?
Well, in summary, I think it's clear federal employees dedicate their careers to serving the public, often in demanding roles.
Mm-hmm.
And they're certainly not immune to getting hurt on the job. Falls, strains, repetitive stress, even that psychological trauma we discussed.
Right.
But the key insight, really, is that getting those legitimate injuries compensated through OWCP, it can be a real uphill battle. It's fraught with these complex rules and potential resistance that most people just don't see.
Yeah, definitely an unseen struggle. But the crucial takeaway for you listening is that despite those hurdles, there are resources available.
Absolutely.
AFGE provides vital education and support for its members. And then you have specialized services like OWCP.doctor offering both expert medical care and that essential claims help, all in one place.
Which makes a huge difference.
By connecting workers with the right DOL-certified doctors, taking away those upfront costs, guiding them through the confusing paperwork, these services really boost the chances of a successful claim and a smoother recovery.
Yeah, this deep dive, I think it reveals not just the risks inherent in federal work, but also those often invisible bureaucratic obstacles that can turn an injury into this long, exhausting fight.
Mm-hmm.
It really underscores that for public servants, having access to knowledge and dedicated support, whether it's from their union or a specialized medical network like this, it isn't just nice to have, it's essential.
Absolutely essential to make sure that the people who serve our country can actually heal and have their rights protected when they get hurt doing that service.
Right.
So when you think about the huge contributions our federal workforce makes every single day, how much more critical does it become to ensure they have truly seamless access to care and compensation when they need it most?
It's definitely something worth thinking about.